Everyone, and in quick succession, welcome to another Sigma webinar and our penultimate for 2021. Today's webinar on Hub and Spoke is very relevant in the current pharmacy world, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you this evening. Unfortunately, Steve Brine cannot be with us to chair this webinar as he's speaking and voting today in Parliament, in fact, right now on the second reading of the Finance Bill. However, we have Gareth Jones, who is the head of corporate affairs at the MPA, to chair this webinar. Gareth leads the external facing advocacy functions of the MPA and supports the board. He has worked extensively on the issue of Hub and Spoke and has been involved in 3 reports that the MPA have published on this topic. Gareth, thank you for chairing today, and I'll pass the stage over to you.
Thank you very much, Hattel. I'd just like to say the MPA are delighted to be able to work with Sigma this evening on this evening's webinar, which, as Hattel said, is a very important and actually a very timely topic. So this evening we have with us speakers from the DHSC and from the GPHC to help us consider Hub and Spoke. And once we've heard from all the speakers, we'll have questions to our panel. And you can submit those questions at any time via the link on YouTube as we're going through. So I'm going to start this evening by providing a short introduction, and then we'll start hearing from our speakers from the DHSC and GPHC. So Hub and Spoke as a concept within community pharmacy and the medicine supply chain in the UK really rose to prominence in 2015 ahead of the first DH consultation on this topic. Intra-company Hub and Spoke, where one corporate entity undertakes different parts of the dispensing process in different areas of its operation, has long been possible. But the change that we've been thinking about since 2015 is inter-company Hub and Spoke, where the Hub and the Spoke sit within different organisations. As Hattel mentioned, the MPA has produced 3 reports on this matter: a review of the challenges and enablers for Hub and Spoke in the UK in 2016, then a review of international evidence, and a report of a roundtable meeting which brought together the supply chain with government and regulators in early 2020. And I'm going to highlight a few of the findings from those 3 reports. So there's not a huge amount of international experience of Hub and Spoke, despite the technology to enable it having been available for many years. The Netherlands is one of the more advanced markets, and we understand that around 30% of independents use Hub and Spoke in the Netherlands. So it's in an established market. Some see a benefit, but the majority do not. And we've also heard that Hub service fees there rose, which did cause a problem for some independents that had already given up their local dispensing capacity. In international markets, there's been much greater uptake for single dose dispensing as opposed to standard original pack dispensing, and that's perhaps unsurprising given that dose dispensing is often a highly manual process. There are, in our view, some barriers to implementation of Hub and Spoke dispensing, and they include supply chain restrictions such as DTP that exist in the UK market, the risk of some wholesalers having an even greater market share, and the new costs such as the Hub's service fee that we will face. There are some enablers that will help make it more possible to incorporate Hub and Spoke, such as if we get new income for clinical services to be undertaken by staff that may be freed up from their dispensing role, clear standards so that Hubs and Spokes can deal with each other with confidence that professional standards are being maintained, and clarity on accountability. So we should all be clear about responsibility should any part of the process go wrong. So our advice to our members when this option becomes available to them will be that there'll be a lot of factors they'll want to consider when determining whether there may be a business case for them to consider Hub dispensing. And we'll stress that there should be no assumptions made that Hub and Spoke will reduce costs, be safer, or release capacity in the way that it may be needed. But we absolutely keep an open mind, and we want to ensure that our members, if there's a way of working out there that works and provides efficiency, we want to ensure that our members are able to access it. So now I'm going to introduce this evening's speakers. First we'll be hearing from the DHSC. Susan Grieve is head of medicines frameworks and the reimbursement team, and a pharmacist within the department responsible for community pharmacy reimbursement and medicines legislative changes affecting pharmacy, including hub and spoke and original pack dispensing. Claymore will also be speaking, and Adrian will be taking questions later, are both also in the medicines framework and reimbursement team. Claymore Richardson is a long-standing civil servant, both at department in the private office and also at the MHRA, where he worked on European policy, including the implementation of FMD, before transferring back to the department to join the Medicines Directorate. Adrian Harper, another long-standing DHSC civil servant, has wide experience in policy development, including general medical services in respect of GPs, nutrition regulation, and NHS performance management, and working with others, including fellow policy colleagues, analysts, and legal. Susan, Claymore, and Adrian have policy responsibility for legislative change around hub and spoke. So first of all, we're going to hear from Susan, so I'll hand over to Susan now.
Thanks, Gareth. Good evening, everybody. Can I have my first slide, please? I can't see it. Brilliant, thank you. Next slide. So Gareth's already touched on what is hub and spoke. So the spoke pharmacies, where the prescription is taken in or where it's received, the hub carries out part of the dispensing process on behalf of the spoke. You would typically have many spokes to one hub. And as Gareth already pointed out, currently medicines legislative framework only allows it across pharmacies that belong to the same legal entity. So in 2016, we consulted on removing that legal impediment so that it could happen across different legal entities. You may remember there was lots of concern about models, accountability, funding, community pharmacy contractual framework. So we paused, but we haven't been idle since then. We have been doing a few things. So since then, we've now got the Community Pharmacy Contractual Framework 5-year deal, which was announced in July 2019. And just before we get into that and why that's important in the context of hub and spoke, just to touch a little bit on the Medicines and Medicines Devices Act, which came into being in 2021, so at the beginning of this year. This is primary legislation, and you may have heard a little bit about it in the press and about how this was to do with hub and spoke. What this actually was to do was to enable us to make amendments to the Human Medicines Regulations and the Medicines Act. It was general powers, not specific to hub and spoke, but enables us to keep all of medicine supply up to date. So it spans from manufacturers through to wholesalers through to pharmacies. The actual provisions to remove the impediment across legal entities will be made via secondary legislation, which hangs off that primary legislation. And that's why we're now getting into the detail of that. So that Medicines and Medical Devices Act, we needed to give us the primary powers to change the Human Medicines Regs and the Medicines Act that was needed to remove that impediment. The reason why we didn't need it in 2016 was at the time we were able to rely on EU regulations, which we're not able to do now that we're out of the EU. So just to sort of explain why that's become so important, the Medicines and Medical Devices Act, which it wasn't in 2016, and we could have proceeded without having to do that primary legislation. But when we left the EU, we needed to do it. Can I have the next slide, please? So just a little bit about the Community Pharmacy Contractual Framework and the 5-year deal. We've just extracted the relevant part here. So that's about an expanded role for community pharmacies, more clinical services, but recognising that if we want that to happen, we need to free pharmacists and their teams up from the more routine aspects of dispensing. And just pointing out that the two areas that we specifically recognised was hub and spoke, so benefits in itself, but especially if you were able to combine that with automation, because if a hub is servicing lots of spokes, then it's more cost effective to make the rationale and the case for automation. And then original pack dispensing as well. So I'm just going to touch on original pack dispensing, which I know was not the topic for tonight. Next slide, please. We have actually just opened a consultation on original pack dispensing. It closes on the 13th of December, so please do think about, have a look at it and respond. That proposes a plus or minus 10% variation in the quantity prescribed compared to the quantity supplied if it enables the supply of an original pack. On every occasion, the pharmacist must apply their judgment to ensure that it won't be to the detriment of the patient's treatment if they receive this plus or minus 10%. It also proposes that sodium valproate is always dispensed in an original pack, and that's to ensure that patients always get the patient information leaflet because of the concerns about trypanogenicity and women of childbearing age. So that is currently the proposals that are out for consultation. As I say, please do respond. And that would again yield efficiencies, but we think if you combine that with hub and spoke, you get a synergistic effect, reaping lots of efficiencies. Next slide, and I think over to Claymore.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good evening, everybody. So over the next couple of few slides, I'm just going to expand a bit more on the work that we're actually doing now, what we're looking at. So hub and spoke dispensing, where parts of the dispensing process can be undertaken on another premises, a hub. So it's currently only possible where hubs form part of the same retail business, as Gareth said. There's an impediment in law that we actually need to go in and remove. So we're looking at legislative amendments that are needed to the 2012 Human Medicines Regulations, which at a UK level provide controls around the supply of medicinal products, and also to the Medicines Act 1968, again, which is UK-wide and provides provisions around the distribution of medicines. So there's UK-wide legislative amendments that we need to go and have a look at to remove the current impediment in law that would enable all hub and spoke, all pharmacies to access hub and spoke. We're also very conscious, I think, of the broader picture, and there may be implications for the NHS pharmaceutical services, which would need to be addressed through the usual way, through discussions with the PSNC. The pharmaceutical and local pharmaceutical service regulations govern the pharmacy arrangements in England, and if amendments were needed, that's where we go and have a look at what was needed at a pharmacy arrangements in terms of England. So we're conscious as well, I guess, of not only the fact that we are going to look at the legislative amendments at a UK level, but also that there are knock-on implications for other bits of regulations. Next slide, please. Also thought it helpful to let you know where we are on our work plan. So working from left to right, so we started kind of looking at the main areas for further discussion, picking up on the 2016 consultation, and we also had an introductory workshop to pick up on what those main themes were. We moved to pre-consultation engagement. We ran a number of workshops, which I will go into a little bit more detail in a moment. We are still talking to stakeholders, and events like this tonight are extremely helpful for us. But in parallel, we are also working to develop what those proposals look like from a legislative basis. This is in particular, in terms of the work plan and what we're talking about tonight, what needs to be changed at UK level to the Human Medicines Regulations and to the Medicines Act. We would then, once we've done that, move to a full public consultation. And I guess the other thing to mention, we need to work up that detail, and these final proposals will be published through a public consultation that we are still to get to. Following that, we'd obviously evaluate the responses of the consultation and go from there. I guess the other thing, and I'm sure a lot of you will want to ask this question, it's on everybody's lips, is when we will be getting to the point where we can publish the consultation. As you can see, we are on a trajectory here and working up the detail. We ran the workshops and we are developing those legislative proposals. We do not have a date for consultation yet confirmed, but you can see that kind of we are moving in that direction. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we held a number of workshops, and just to cover some of the breadth of topics, the main themes that we covered, including patient safety, accountability, patient information transparency, the different hub and spoke models, and level playing field. Some of these, the majority of these, were around the changes to the Human Medicines Regulations and to the Medicines Act, but there were other areas of concern, important issues that went beyond scope. Next slide, please. This slide hopefully captures a number of the key themes that were raised through those workshops. They've been broken down into two groups. So you can look on the left-hand side, the ones that are in blue. They are the ones that are prospective consultation and the enabling the wider use of hub and spoke through the Human Medicines Regulations, through the Medicines Act capture. So the ability to utilize more than one hub, so that may be for business resilience reasons, or whether specific products are sourced from one hub compared to others from another hub. The transparency that hub and spoke is actually being utilized. So with using two different organizations, being clear to the patient that actually hub and spoke is happening and then the medicine is being sent off to be put together somewhere else. Clear about accountability was a very, very important theme. In terms of the dispensing process, as it will be split between two organisations. You need to know who is doing what, a very strong theme that came out in our workshops. Both registered pharmacies, something again that was raised through the 2016 consultation. Clear information around patients and who is responsible, the clear message that you don't want a patient not knowing who to go to where hub and spoke is being used. And the hub and spokes to decide who is responsible for which stages of the dispensing process, and that links back to accountability. And also, I guess, the importance to have flexibility for different organisations to adopt the best innovative model that works for them, finding something that works in reality. And then on the right-hand side, some of the other really important issues that were raised, which are outside of the scope of our work on the Human Medicines Regulations and the Medicines Act, but really important issues nonetheless, and areas that we need to also work through. The GPHC, standard and guidance for hubs, the sharing of patient information between the spoke and the hub and the spoke, fair access to medicines, and Gareth talked about direct to pharmacy and other things. Competitive hub market and performance indicators, making sure there is a vibrant hub market out there, and market entry as well. So these are some of the key themes that came through our presentation, through our workshops, and I hope are helpful for people to see. And I think that ends our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claymore. Thank you, Susan, for that presentation. So now we're going to move over to the GPHC. Clearly important questions for to GPHC to help us understand here and about the way it changes practice and how pharmacies are regulated. So Duncan Rudkin will be speaking to us in a second. So Duncan was appointed by the Privy Council as the founding Chief Executive and Registrar of the GPHC. And has been with the organisation since its inception in 2010. Prior to that, Duncan had worked in the General Dental Council for a number of years, including a period as chief executive there, and his original professional background was as a commercial solicitor. So over to Duncan now to hear the GPHC view on this issue.
Thanks very much, Gareth. First of all, I thought it might be helpful if I just said a few words about the GPHC's overall approach and the operating principles that will guide both our contribution to policy discussions, our approach to the consultation, and ultimately our approach to operationalising, if that's the right word, any new arrangements through the standards and inspection work we do. So I'll begin with a few general observations about our overall approach. I'll then say a little bit more in a bit more detail about the relevant standards that I think are going to be particularly important as you think through how you might, whether and if so how, you might take advantage ultimately of the option that may be given through the change that's being contemplated. So first of all, in relation to the GPHC's overall approach, I think it's important to highlight that the Council is very committed to using its regulatory levers and influence to really be proactive in enabling and supporting responsible innovation. We want to use the standards that the Council sets and the work we do to inspect for example, and uphold those standards, really to not just to provide assurance of safety, which is obviously hugely important for any regulator, but also to promote actively to promote improvement in standards of care. And so that will be guiding our approach to hub and spoke as we move forward. We see opportunities here, and we will want to look at how we can explore those to work with you to improve standards through this potential innovation. Secondly, I think it's important to highlight some of the limitations of our work and our role. From a business point of view, some of the concerns and questions that you may have now and in the future around this will be essentially commercial questions around, for example, competition issues, a range of kind of issues around commercial fairness, buying power, and so on, as you try to work out whether this is a form of operation that you want to get involved in. The GPHC doesn't regulate the pharmacy market as an economic regulator might do. So there will be limitations to the kind of topics that we would get involved in. And we certainly wouldn't regard it as part of our role to arbitrate between businesses in commercial issues between them. Thirdly, I think it's important to highlight that a key driver for us, and this goes back to what I was saying just now about improving standards, a key driver for us is to use every lever we have to promote professionalism. And I'd ask you to bear this in mind as we move forward, both through what I'm going to say about the standards, but also generally, because this is going to be critical to the GPHC approach. If you're thinking about designing new services and new models for delivering existing services, inevitably you'll be thinking about a really wide range of issues, including issues like capacity and efficiency. We will be asking you to explain, or to be ready to explain when we're inspecting, how you're also thinking about how you use system changes actively to promote professionalism, by which I mean specifically to promote and uphold the ability of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians to live up to their professional obligations. And that includes responsible pharmacists, but also superintendent pharmacists as individuals in your organizations. The next general point that I have is around our focus on outcomes. As the pharmacy regulator, we cover a wide range of different types of services in a hugely varied range of contexts. We have a small number of sets of standards, some of which I'm going to say a bit more about in a minute, which cover a huge range of different types of services and models and contexts, and they can't specify in detail, nor should they attempt to, every single step that you must take. You are the experts in your businesses. The standards that we set are about identifying in fairly broad terms the outcomes which we say you should be meeting for the public. And the detail of how you're going to do that in any particular context, in any particular service model, is going to vary hugely. So when you're thinking about, well, what am I going to need to do in order to satisfy the GPHC or be compliant, which is not necessarily a phrase that I would encourage, or at the very least avoid getting into trouble with the GPHC. However you look at it, the place to start in understanding our requirements is the GPHC standards. There are two key sets of standards that are going to be very, very relevant and which will provide really an essential framework for you to think through the issues in designing your models if you go down this road. Those two sets of standards are the standards for pharmacy professionals, which of course apply to pharmacists and pharmacy technicians as individual professionals, and the standards for registered pharmacies, which of course are the standards against which your pharmacies are inspected. So I'm going to say a little bit about those two sets of standards and how they are relevant, or may be relevant, to hub and spoke, because I'm going to encourage you to think that if you're contemplating in future using this facility that potentially the law will allow in a new way, then the standards can really act as a useful framework for helping you make sure you do that in a way that is safe and responsible and professional. So first of all, I think it's worth highlighting a number of key points from the standards for pharmacy professionals, which, as I've reminded you, apply to all pharmacists and pharmacy technicians as individuals. These standards apply at all times and in all contexts. And individual pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, as you know, are professionally accountable for their own practice. And that's true whether they're in a patient-facing role, or indeed whether they're operating as a pharmacist or a pharmacy technician, not in a patient-facing role directly, but perhaps in a management, leadership, or governance role. The standards for pharmacy professionals are the go-to place to understand the professional responsibilities of members of the pharmacy professions. And part of the job of pharmacy owners is to create an environment in which those individual professionals can live up to those expectations. The standards for pharmacy professionals standards contain a number of key points, many of which are going to be relevant to think about in terms of designing hub and spoke models. Some of these Claymore has touched on already from a different point of view in relation to really important issues like consent, for example, which is covered in the standards for pharmacy professionals, issues around working in partnership, and professional obligation to work effectively with other team members. Obviously hugely important where a very important service is shared amongst not only a number of individuals, but in this case, potentially a number of organizations. The responsibilities of individual pharmacy professionals also include things like making and using appropriate records, which is going to be important in this context, and obviously hugely important, communicating effectively with others involved in the person's care and managing information responsibly, securely, and in compliance with all relevant legal obligations. These are just a few of the key points in standards for pharmacy professionals that I've pulled out as I think being particularly likely to be relevant to be thinking about in a hub and spoke context. But as I've mentioned, that's one of the two key sets of standards, the other one being the standards for registered pharmacies. And you'll all be familiar with these, I'm sure. These are the standards which our inspectors use when they're inspecting a pharmacy of any kind. And of course, they are quite broadly defined, but again, they're going to be very relevant to hub and spoke and can be used as a framework, I think, for risk assessment and risk management. We've seen this done very effectively in the development of vaccination services, where the standards for registered pharmacies are a framework to help people think through and plan their approaches. And I think the same approach could be really helpful here. It's possible, I think, to go through every single principle in the standards for registered pharmacies and highlight the relevance to hub and spoke. I'm not going to go through every single line, but I thought it might be helpful to illustrate with a few key examples. In relation, for example, to Principle 4 of the standards for registered pharmacies, you may remember that Principle 4 says as follows: the way in which pharmacy services, including the management of medicines and medical devices, are delivered safeguards the health, safety and well-being of patients and members of the public. The standards talk about medicines and medical devices that must be obtained from a reputable source, and amongst other things, stored securely, safeguarded from unauthorized access, and supplied to the patient safely. Clearly very relevant to thinking through hub and spoke models potentially. Principle 5 also, I think, is relevant perhaps in a way that may be slightly less obvious. Principle 5 is about equipment and facilities. It reminds us that equipment and facilities used in the provision of pharmacy services must safeguard the health, safety and well-being of patients and the public. To my mind, that equipment and facilities phrase has quite a broad definition. And I think it's important to highlight that it would certainly include things like business systems that must be safe, for example, safe and fit to use. And as with all the standards for registered pharmacies, running throughout all aspects of that is that theme around promoting professionalism, which I mentioned right at the beginning, which is where the standards for registered pharmacies and the standards for individual professionals really come together around the owner's responsibility for enabling individual pharmacists and pharmacy technicians to provide a professional service in accordance with the standards for pharmacy professionals. I'll finish with some highlights of Principle 1 from the standards for registered pharmacies. Principle 1 really covers a huge amount of important ground that's going to be very relevant to hub and spoke models. The governance arrangements that you have in place must safeguard the health, safety and well-being of patients and the public. We go on to say, governance arrangements includes having clear definitions of the roles and accountabilities of the people involved in providing and managing pharmacy services. It includes the arrangements for managing risks and the way the registered pharmacy is managed and operated. That's going to be very relevant to both the hub and the spoke and to the relationship between the two of them. The standards go on to say in a little bit more detail important messages around identifying and managing risk, regular review and monitoring of safety and quality, the importance of ensuring that staff have clearly defined roles and lines of accountability, that appropriate indemnity or insurance arrangements are in place, proper records are kept and used, and that information is managed appropriately. All of these have been identified as key themes actually in the workshops that Claire Moore was telling us about earlier. Not surprising at all, but they're already there in the standards for registered pharmacies. So that's my key, if there's a takeaway message from me, it's the standards for pharmacy professionals and particularly the standards for registered pharmacies are the place to start in understanding the GPHC's requirements, how they're going to apply to hub and spoke models in the context of those strategic drivers that I mentioned around enabling responsible innovation and promoting professionalism. I hope that's helpful, Gareth. Happy to take part in answering questions with colleagues in a minute.
Great, thanks a lot, Duncan. So now we will move to questions, and I've had a number of questions that have been pre-submitted, and then I can see some questions are coming in this evening as well. So I've got quite a few questions, one or two challenging questions, and this is a controversial topic, as we all know. And the first one we've got this evening is from Barrett Shah at Sigma. Pharmacists want to be clinical professionals, but if dispensing goes away, are they likely to be left high and dry with nothing in return? Is this a clever way to reduce the number of pharmacies? Who'd like to respond to that one first?
Hi, Gareth. I'll answer. So I think we need to be very clear to start off that these changes that we are proposing and the changes that we would make to legislation are all enabling. It will be up to individual pharmacy organisations to make their own decision about whether this is something they want to utilise. The role in respect to dispensing is not being taken away, it remains with the spoke. The legislative change proposed will enable it for it to be undertaken somewhere else. So I guess that the key bit I'm trying to get across there, it's enabling. Organisations will have to take their own decision on whether they want to use this.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Gareth, if I may, I'll just add slightly tangential maybe, but I think it gives me a prompt to illustrate the point that I was trying to make around professionalism, because yes, understandably the focus of a lot of the discussion is going to be around the details of the process for supply, but I think it's really important to highlight that those obligations around professionalism, the professional service and the professional commitment that Barrett was mentioning certainly apply to the pharmacist's role in supporting safe supply just as much as they do to any other, perhaps more obviously, dare I say, clinical service. It's really important, I think, that we don't lose sight of that for a whole host of reasons.
Next question is from Pri at Pharmacy Business Magazine. In fact, this is sort of in two parts, so I'll ask them both now. So although no one is talking about costs just yet, a huge investment will surely be required to set up a hub and spoke dispensing. How will you convince a small independent community pharmacy contractor who has already made substantial investment in technology to increase efficiency to make yet another big investment? And the sort of follow-up question is, if this is really about freeing up pharmacists for greater clinical roles, how about rolling out more efficient patient medication record systems to save contractors both a lot of time and money? Susan, do you want to cover this?
So on the first one about the investment, yes, we recognise that for a hub there will need to be a huge investment, particularly if it's going to go down the automation route, which is where the real efficiencies come. Two things though, sort of go back to Claymore's point about this is enabling. So we're not forcing anybody to do this. So if they can't make the business case stack up, then they don't need to do it. The business case needs to stack up. We get that. And if it doesn't, then there's no point doing it. We do have to publish an impact assessment alongside the consultation. So, I don't have all the answers here because we haven't finished that impact assessment, but that will be sort of setting out how we see it. But I suppose I just keep coming back to it's enabling. And if it doesn't work for people's business model, then we wouldn't expect them to do it. Just on the second point about patient medication records, I suppose one of the reasons why we hope to be able to make more progress than we did in 2016 is that we're progressing this all within the context of the community pharmacy contractual framework 5-year deal. And the two things that we said our side of the bargain to help pharmacies for efficiencies was to enable hub and spoke across the different legal entities and original pack dispensing. If there are other things that people need, then they need to feed through into that conversation. These were the things as part of the 5-year deal that we said we would try to progress.
Okay, and the next question I think is linked. This is from Richard Thomas at P3 Magazine, and he's saying, as far as independence and hub and spoke is concerned, where is the business model? I think I might express some thoughts on that one, but again, do you want to respond to that first?
So guys, sorry, I'll just sort of go back to what I said to the previous one, really, which is, every pharmacy works differently. It'll have different benefits for different pharmacies, and also depending on how much they want the hub to do for them. So, we don't expect to be prescriptive about that. We expect each pharmacy to think themselves. Claymore touched on, you might even want to work with 2 hubs. So you might have or your sort of MDS done by one hub and your non-MDS done somewhere else, or your bulk, we expect every pharmacy to think creatively about what does and doesn't work for them. So it's kind of, although having said we've got to do an impact assessment, it's kind of impossible for us to for each individual pharmacy, they've got to see how and if it works for them.
Yeah, our views on this one are that currently we think it's quite difficult to build a business model for independent community pharmacy for hub and spoke. Certainly for the majority, there may be some who can see it working for them. Maybe, for example, they've got a problem with their premises and they can't cope with capacity they're trying to do in the pharmacy, and outsourcing some of that dispensing may make sense to them. But particularly because there's not much new income to actually use people that are freed up by hub and spoke, and we know there'll be service fees, and actually just some of the practicalities of dealing with patients, and the fact that patients leave their ordering to the last minute. So the 72-hour lead time is a bit of a problem. Medicines get changed at the last minute. All sorts of practical issues that make it more difficult to just currently anyway build that business case. But I guess we should be open-minded. Systems will change, technology will change, things might change over time, but we can't currently see a really strong business case that lots of people will be rushing out immediately wanting to use. Any more thoughts on that question before we move on to the next one? No, okay. So Rob Darracott from CRG. Is today's proposal to level the playing field for hub and spoke different to what was abandoned in 2016? With hindsight, has the abandonment in 2016 set independents back, since multiples have had 5 more years of experience and understanding, of using and understanding the technology?
Hi, Gareth. Shall I start this one?
Yeah.
I guess, first of all, we need to be careful not to diminish the outcome of the 2016 consultation. There were important concerns that were raised there by stakeholders, and because of that, we paused work, and then we agreed to take away the concerns raised and develop some of that detail. And I then turned to two of the points that Susan raised in her part of the presentation. Firstly, that this was picked up as part of the 5-year deal, the community pharmacy contractual framework. And secondly, I think the fact that we were, I guess, sidetracked or had to pick up primary legislation through the Medicines and Medical Devices Act to actually enable that, ensure that we've got the powers to take this forward. So I guess a couple of elements to that, to the answer there, but others might want to add to that.
Well, I mean, I might add a comment. I mean, certainly the multiples have had the last 5 years, but I don't see this revolutionising practice within the multiples either. Certainly, when you talk to pharmacists and pharmacy staff that are working in pharmacies that are using hub services within a chain, they report problems with it. They report it doesn't. Often the long, complicated prescriptions you want to sort of get outsourced because they take you a lot of time, just don't work with hubs because they contain lots of complicated medicines that just can't be handled in the hub in the automated way. So what I've heard people say is you can get rid of the simple stuff, the single items that actually you could dispense very quickly, and actually that's where the sort of this business case doesn't really stack up. So you can lose the easy work that you don't want to get rid of. It's much more difficult to lose the time-consuming work that you would like to try to outsource. So I mean, I don't think they spent the last 5 years really exploiting great benefits from it, and I also don't see lots of investment in the big multiples either at the moment, which would be a sign that they thought it was working really well for them. And I think if it can't work really well inside one company, the chances of it working well when you've got different companies involved, is low in my opinion. So now we'll move on to Valeria from C&D. Now, a specific question which I'm not sure you may be able to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. When is the DH planning to launch its consultation on the hub and spoke model, and how soon could the law change to allow independent pharmacies to benefit from it?
Hi, Gareth. So I did try and pick this one up in the presentation because I do think obviously it's the question on people's minds. As I said, you can see that we've had the workshops. We're moving forward in terms of developing the proposals for legislative change. That's a positive step in the right direction. As I said, we don't have a date for the consultation yet. In terms of, I guess, parliamentary process post-consultation, we need to be careful again that we don't preempt the consultation. We've got to let the consultation run its course and see what comes out of it. But a positive outcome, we'd have to go through a parliamentary process to put that into law.
Okay. And actually, a similar question for Duncan. And the question is, how is the GPHC preparing for this change in legislation? How will it respond to potential patient safety concerns that may arise as a wider part of the sector being given access to this model? And I guess perhaps a slightly supplementary question. How do you see the inspection regime changing when we have hub pharmacies? As we know, as we've been told, so that the hubs will be registered pharmacies.
Thanks, Gareth. So in terms of GPHC preparations, they would cover all of the different kinds of work that we do that are relevant. So by which I mean policy and guidance, communications activity that we'll be doing to support that, and indeed inspection. So in relation to policy work, first of all, one of the things that we will be considering if the change moves forward is whether any particular additional guidance is required from the GPHC. I've summarised some of the key themes from the standards, but on particular topics, we do sometimes, as you know, produce more detailed guidance which sets out our expectations in a bit more detail, and that can be useful in particular circumstances, and we'll certainly consider whether we would need to do that for hub and spoke. There are some relevant themes that one can trace through, for example, in the guidance that we've already produced for distance selling pharmacies, including those online. It's a different context, but some of the themes are very relevant. So we'd be looking at that in terms of policy. We'd also be continuing to work very closely in preparation with other organisations and agencies. That would include, perhaps particularly on this topic, for example, MHRA. We're already in quite detailed discussions with MHRA, for example, on some relevant topics that we'd want to explore further with them, for example, in relation to things like the interface between our standards and their requirements in terms of GDP, for example, in terms of some of the logistics issues that will arise. So there'll be a range of work there. There'll be communications work to make sure that everybody knows what to expect from us when. And there will be internally, of course, work with our inspector colleagues to make sure that they're ready to inspect. We've adapted and developed the inspection model and our own expertise within the organisation and our capacity within the organisation as services have evolved. So, for example, we now have a wider range of clinical expertise, including experienced prescribers within the inspection team and on call to the inspection team, who can support with some of those more prescribing focused services. Likewise, with more technical services, we're expanding the range of skills available to the inspection team, either through inspectors directly or through on-call support for them, to make sure that they're equipped with the right technical questions to ask when they're seeking assurance around how people are applying the standards. So that's the kind of approach that you'd expect to see from us, covering all of the different aspects of our work that will be relevant.
Thank you very much. Now, a question here from Baraton Jyoti Shah. It's coming on YouTube. Now, we've, I think, partially answered this by this point, but I think it's still worth picking up the point because it's a really important one. Is hub to spoke dispensing or wholesaling, and does the hub need a wholesale dealer's license? Who wants to provide the clarification on that one?
Shall I start? Go on, yeah, go for it, Susan. No, go for it, Susan.
So our proposal is that both the hub and the spoke are pharmacies, but part of that is so that the end-to-end is regulated by one regulator. But clearly that's a consultation, but that's where we would start.
Just to add, Gareth, one of the consequences of that approach, of course, would be that you would import all of the familiar governance and regulatory arrangements that you'd expect in a pharmacy, including things like the role of the RP and the superintendent, as well as the pharmacy standards and inspection. That would all be part of the deal if indeed the hubs are confirmed as requiring to be pharmacies. And that from a GPHC point of view, I would say that is consistent. That approach would be consistent with that theme around professionalism and ensuring that that is embedded at every stage in the process from end to end in the way that Susan's mentioned.
Okay, so Sudhir Monji is asking us to say a little bit more about where liability sits. So if I'm a pharmacist in a spoke pharmacy supplying medicines that were assembled in the hub? How can I be clear about what I'm responsible for, what the hub is responsible for, and if they've made a mistake, can I be sure that I'm not going to be held accountable?
Susan, Claymore, I'm happy to go first if that's helpful from a GPHC point of view. Of course, worth highlighting, just as a sort of preliminary comment, that there are different sorts of liability that one has to think about. There can be criminal liabilities if we get things badly wrong. There can be civil liabilities in terms of negligence, and of course there are sometimes regulatory liabilities, as it were, through the actions of the regulator in holding individuals accountable, and also through the work we do through inspection and enforcement where we need to with pharmacies. So there are different sorts of liabilities. I think I would highlight one of the key themes that came through for me very much in the workshops that Claymore described earlier, which was a sort of cardinal principle that I think from my part I observed all colleagues were signed up to, that I would hope we would all agree, which is that the patient, we must between us ensure that these arrangements mean that the patient is able to get recourse where they need to in the event of something unfortunately going wrong, patient having a problem. The arrangements between the parties, between the pharmacy parties, must be such that, in a sense, it doesn't leave the patient stranded. We mustn't end up in a situation where the hub and the spoke are pointing the finger at each other and the patient is left high and dry. That's something I think we would all share as an important principle. In terms of the registered pharmacies standards, which I mentioned, there's a very important emphasis in the governance principle around being very clear, exactly as the questioner has highlighted, being very clear about accountabilities, responsibilities and accountabilities. And my kind of primary starting point would be the contracting parties, the hub and the spoke organisations, must work that out between them to be very clear who is doing what, who is responsible for what in terms of delivery, and who is accountable for what at the end of the day, so that the patient, in a sense, should not need to worry about any of that. That is the ultimate end we should be working towards, it seems to me.
Yep. Okay, well, I think this is probably going to have to be the last question as we're running out of time. This comes from Chris Martin. He's saying last week's announcement suggested that the government has decided decided to pause work on all 4 proposals from the original 2016 consultation. What does this mean for timelines? And I've actually heard a few people making that point, so I think it would be helpful to have a response from Susan or Claymore just to clarify that position.
Shall I start, Susan? So yes, I have seen this one as well. No, I think it's important to note that I guess in the process of moving forwards to a new consultation, we wanted to and had to publish the 2016 consultation response. I think the point in terms of pausing was picked up in terms of what happened at the time. We are still proceeding as we have done in terms of our preparations and pursuing legislative change around hub and spoke. That pause should be seen a kind of retrospective view backwards, noting that it was in response to the 2016 consultation, not in terms of what we are doing now.
Okay, thank you, Claymore. Well, I think we are just about out of time now on the questions, so thank you everybody for your responses, and I think we covered a fair bit there actually in the hour. I mean, we could spend all day or all week almost talking about hub and spoke. There is so much that you could discuss on this topic, and there's so much more work that needs to be done between now and the point at which independent spoke could really realistically operate. Lots of thinking that needs to be done and points that need to be clarified, but I think we've gone through a lot of those issues this evening, so thank you everybody, and I'm now going to hand over to Bharat Shah, who's going to say a few final words before we finish.
Thank you very much, Gareth. We've now come to the end of an excellent webinar discussing hub and spoke. I wish to thank Susan Grieve, Adrian Harper, Claymore Richardson, and Duncan Rudkin for accepting our invitation to be speakers today. And also Gareth, for you to come in at very short notice instead of Steve Bryan as the chair. Thank you very much. I'm also very grateful to all the speakers who have answered many of the questions that have come in today. Without taking too much of your time, I would like to announce that we have our last webinar this year with Oxford University on 1st December 2021, who are conducting clinical trials on treatment of COVID-19 using combination of traditional generic medicines. Professor Christopher Butler, Professor Mahendra Patel, Professor Faith Ozier, and others will be discussing this very interesting subject. The webinar is to discuss the clinical trial and the help Oxford University is requesting from pharmacies, health professionals, African and Southeast Asian communities. This webinar is between 7:30 p.m. and 9 p.m. on Wednesday, the 1st December. I look forward to seeing you all on 1st December. Thank you again to the Sigma team and today's speakers. Good night. Thank you, everybody. We will